we have a question that relates to that. So maybe we'll start that and we'll kind of meander through some of these. So can you tell us about the process of transcribing the diary?
Well, I discovered the diary in the mid-1990s, thanks to Rose Byrne, who worked at the Historical Society. And I had students each read a section of it, and that convinced me that it was a very interesting diary. And I began to transcribe. I think I did about a tenth, but I added up the pages yesterday. I have 1,047 pages of MIM transcripts. And it turns out, I think that's really useful now because a lot of people can't read cursive handwriting. And so at least we'll have this record, even though I can see lots of errors in it about her life. So I thought at the end it would be fast when Mim was widowed because she wrote 293 letters. And my undergraduates had hated these letters. She lived such a complex life and her husband was so difficult. And now he's a saint. And now, they were just angry. So I thought I would whisk through those. To me, they are the most heartbreaking and beautiful record of widowhood that I've ever seen. I actually am at the very end of a book manuscript reading them, and I can only read them for about a half hour before I just have tears in my eyes.
So
that's where diaries really help us because letters are often very upbeat. I studied missionary women's diaries in New Zealand, and if they were writing for funding agencies in Britain, every day was sunshine, and our natives were so grateful. But in a Methodist woman's diary, which she didn't send to relatives, you could just see the agony. There's a wonderful book called Pioneer Mother, I believe, about Gro Svensson's diary. And she came from Norway, eventually ending up in Iowa, and it's just heartbreaking. Children have died on the ship. I shouldn't have come. I've broken my parents' heart. Her first letter to her parents when she gets to America, we are safely landed with no incident in this wonderful new book. So diaries really get you into the gritty events.
Oh, definitely. So, I mean, I think that kind of leads into another question that we have. And what is it about the Mim Diaries you think will most interest readers?
Stories about immigration and having your ties to home and watching them slowly fade away. For people interested in Irish history, there is tons of information about politics, the Free State, our Civil War. She had literary interests, so it's amazing how many literary lights came to Arizona, especially in the winter, to speak at the university or sometimes up in Phoenix. She knows about Frank Lloyd Wright in Phoenix. She just had a very inquisitive mind, and I think that's good. And then to watch her, like many of us are not born in the Southwest, to watch her make her peace with the Southwest is interesting, poignant.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, as a born and bred Tucsonan, you know, I thought it was really interesting the way that she describes kind of a growing, changing Arizona, right? In the 1920s, you have a massive movement into the state. For the first time, the Anglo-American population exceeds the Mexican-American population of the state. Phoenix is really starting to become a destination for people as opposed to just kind of a dusty outpost somewhere. And so it's really starting to kind of change that narrative about what Arizona is like. And you still get the nostalgia for the West, the Wild West, although I found the scene in the Tombstone garage to be particularly funny, thinking about Tombstone as being this kind of, you know, desolate place where nobody lived. It was an old rundown boom town, and now it's kind of this glittery amusement park, for lack of a better phrase.
Yeah, and she and Patty lived in Bisbee in the boom days.
Oh, yeah.
And a lot of people, as you said, think of Bisbee as kind of this little tourist mecca, but the history and the labor history. Another part that I love that I find really hard to edit out are her auto travel in Arizona because of the few paved roads, of the things they say, of her usually negative take on various places that she gets to. They crawl their way to the Grand Canyon twice in their life. They horrify her visiting Irish sister when they take her on the Apache Trail. So they kind of get this glee, as you do when you're a Southwesterner, of people's amazement at the landscape.
Yeah, definitely. So to kind of jump tracks a little bit, tell us about Mim.
Well, Mim was 5 years older than her husband. I don't think she expected to marry. She had gone from Longford, Ireland to London as an accountant and had worked for the British government, but then she came back to care for her mother and continued then work for the British government in Dublin, where she met Patty. And as I mentioned, I'm at the very end of the diary, and she's destroying love letters between them. I wish we had all of them, but we know enough to understand that she was wary of living with her widowed father-in-law and Patty, and that became increasingly uncomfortable. And then the life-changing event was the diagnosis of tuberculosis for Patty. And then that puts them in a large historical context of all the people, as you mentioned, that moved to the West to get cures for their tuberculosis. And later in their life, they had two friends who had half of their lungs removed.
Oh, wow.
Battling tuberculosis. So they end up, to make a long story short, in Bisbee. They both work not in the mines, but in mining companies and stores. And then when things dry up in Bisbee, they move to Tucson. Actually, they do a short foray into Oracle and are rained out of there and say, we'll return to Tucson is the lesser evil. And so they come here. Mim had misspelled Tucson, as people still do, okay? And then they slowly kind of fit in. And I think big change was when Patty works briefly for the University of Arizona. And that connects them to literary people, cultured people that Mim seems to find her peers. But one of the wonderful tensions in the diary is she always feels slightly an outsider, both economically, because she and Patty don't have the same amount of money, and the fact that the faculty all leave for the summer and they're stuck in Tucson. So then they slowly begin, when they have a little bit more money, these migrations to California. My undergraduates, these are undergraduates, said, we cannot believe the amount of drinking in this diary. During Prohibition, no problem. These people got into their vehicles and just drove through washes, drove off roads. It's amazing what they did. And actually, the diary has, it's almost an evolution of drinking. There's this new wine called Chablis. There is a new drink called Irish Mist. There is it's a gimlet, and here's what's in it. So you have them really a heavy drinking culture, of which Mim was pretty critical. And what I love about the diary is she'll tell you who's who at these parties, but then come home and skewer them. And so-and-so was hanging over so-and-so's husband, etc. Mim's husband, Patty, also drank, and that caused quite a bit of tension in their marriage. He became a certified public accountant, and at home, Mim helped him a lot with his work. Because they were uneasily in the middle class, it would have been inappropriate, even though she did not have children, for her to be working outside the home. So she did a lot of work for Patty. Eventually, they go in their early 60s back to Ireland, and just have a negative experience. One of her sisters calls her a fat yank. All right, so
Wow.
that doesn't help. And
Wow.
it's Mim's diary, so she says she, like someone out of the French Revolution. So back and forth, and because of all these reunions and the dank air, they actually have to leave Ireland a month early because Patty is getting so ill. But that also confirms their earlier decision to move to Arizona, because look what would have happened. His brother died of tuberculosis. Many of Mim's nieces and nephews at young ages died of tuberculosis. So they made the right decision, but now they knew they couldn't ever return to Ireland. And so they bought burial plots at Holy Hope Cemetery, which eventually they would use. They were married for almost 51 years.
Wow, it's a long time.
Right. And at the end, they could no longer drive to California. So in 1963, they took a bus to California, and they weren't even there a week before Mim discovers Patty dead in the morning. And so that leads to a whole new role of her life as a dependent. One of the kindest people to her was Father Kevin McArdle, who I was lucky enough to interview several times. He was an Irish-born priest who worked mostly in the barrio and was very fluent in Irish, English, and Spanish. And he befriended Mim, had his boys drive her to and from church when her friends couldn't take her to church, and was really her solace. And the first time I interviewed him, he seemed very embarrassed by my bold question of why Patty and Mim did not have children, and kind of blushed and didn't really respond to that. But about a week after our interview, he sent me Mim's most wonderful essay that she gave in 1921.
Oh, wow.
Okay, about pride in knowing the Irish rebels and the revolutionaries. And he wrote on her speech, "I found this by happy accident, and you should have it." So that means Mim wrote it, it's her handwriting, in 1921. She must have given it to Father McArdle at some time in the future, and now he's saving it until about 2006, I think, when he gives it to me. I mean, isn't that just amazing? It's really a confluence and shows so much of her strength. My husband and I traveled twice to Ireland. The second time, I had wonderful times with Mim's grandnieces. Met Mim's grandniece, who became part of the London Symphony and was very talented.
Oh, wow.
And she's the one that gave me the earliest picture we have of Mim and Patty, which is a very idealized, it's in the article, picture of them as young, perhaps betrothed or newlyweds. And when she gave that to me, I took it as her trusting moment to say, you will finish bringing Mim's diary to life, and how much she missed Ireland.
Yeah.
The family always called Mim and Patty their exiles. That is really the word that many Irish used, because to say you moved away to better your life was rather hurtful.
Sure.
So they were exiled from Ireland.
Sure. Oh my gosh, there's so many things. Thinking about diaries are really, we discussed a little bit diaries and how powerful diaries are, and I think diaries are a really unique way to get into women's stories in particular, because diaries are written with the belief, whether or not that belief is rooted in reality, that no one will ever read it. So you can say whatever it is that you need to say that you would never say to anyone's face. And so we get a lot of Mim's personality and her unfiltered opinions on people, but also thinking about how you had just mentioned that a dear friend of hers had saved some of her writings, and then eventually they make their way back to us. And it's really interesting to think about how women's history gets recorded, if not for, of course, we've done a ton of research looking at government documents and official paperwork and newspapers and things like that, kind of the traditional sources of historical knowledge. And then you have these wonderful primary sources that exist that give us an insight into her life, which I just think is fascinating. And another thing that I think is fascinating, I think our readers will find particularly fascinating, is thinking about folks moving to Arizona for that 6C, the climate, and thinking about quarantine in particular, and not just the tuberculosis quarantine, but the meningitis quarantine that happens. Is it meningitis in Bisbee? Yeah, the meningitis quarantine that happens in Bisbee. So, that too, the Spanish flu of the same time period. So, I mean, I think even if Mim doesn't directly comment on it, we were all a little, as historians of Arizona, we were all a little struck that Mim says very little about the Bisbee deportation. But the way that she comments on Arizona history and the way that she lives through some of Arizona's most historic events, it's so fascinating.
You hit the nail on the head. It's how she lives through it.
Exactly.
So that's a minor inconvenience, because during the Bisbee deportation, why don't we go to California and get out of the heated area of Bisbee? So it's always the diarist's ego usually is foremost. Robert Fothergill said something like, wars and rebellions, everything happens. But above all of those, contesting history is the individual who says that I matter. Now, you brought up the interesting point of, did they ever expect it to be read? I cannot believe it is Mim put volume after volume of her diary on the shelf, and people ask sometimes for her to refer it to. She was kind of Wikipedia before we had one.
Oh, how funny.
When did we buy our house? When did this first thing happen? Especially because she has coding in her diary. I think she did think others would read it. We're beneficiaries of previous scholars. My first diary that I studied in Iowa was only brought to light because Andrea Hinding was doing a book about manuscript holdings in the United States by women. And I walked into the Iowa State Historical Society and said, have any diaries by women? And they said, yes, we do have one that no one else has ever read. Well, that was book number one. And likewise with Mim, I think Sandra Myers was here for a women's studies conference and came into the library at the Historical Society and asked what materials they had on women. And they were rather vague. And people who remember Sandra would go, yeah. And so in the early 90s, they began to work on Mim's diary. And so then when I walked in and said, not learning from my past, do you have any women's diaries? Rose Guring was able to say, yes, we have one that has recently been accessed and no other person has read it. And you mentioned women's lives. In every diary that I've studied, women usually foreground their entry by talking about their work, whether it's farm work in Iowa or Mim's work of doing millions of dishes or cleaning up cigarette ashes after social events, that they want to say, I did my work and now I can comment snippily on the party last night. But they wanted us to know that their work counted. During tax season, she and Patty would stay up until midnight doing these forms, Mim doing them side by side with them. She did work.
Understanding of the reality of the situation.
Well, let me bring up an interesting point. In Bisbee, when they're unemployed for the first few weeks, Mim says, perhaps I should try to turn to writing because that would earn us a little money. I should try to do that. So she did justify the creative writing that she tried, only one story of which we think was ever published, by saying it would earn us some money if I did this. And you see that through all the 19th century, all those romantic women writers who often were widowed or divorced, saying, I have to support my family. Harriet Beecher Stowe, I hope that I'll be able to buy a black dress with the royalties from Uncle Tom's Cabin.
So what most surprised you about Mim's diaries?
Well, as I've mentioned, the poignancy of those last letters. I had no idea of how much she suffered and how the community surrounded her as much as they could with love. I think that was the greatest surprise. Sometimes the diary gets tedious with the drunken drives home from Nogales, etc. Oh, and there are also several friends, like William John Tucker, who was an outrageous professor at the university, who almost overtake her diary. All right, so she just has to talk about how boorish he was, how he stumbled home, how his much younger wife, previous student, was rude to everyone. So you have these interests vying in her diary, and it evolves too. One of the most prominent themes in diaries is health. And as Mim slowly became disabled and eventually would die from sepsis, to hear her write about her foot and how huge it was.
What a terrible way to die. Sepsis is horrible.
But she didn't want to afford a doctor. And finally, her friends send the doctor over. But my colleagues and I think she really was, by that point, very much welcoming death and wanting to join Patty. I think just that it's a remarkable record, that it was kept for history by India Smalling, who basically was the secretary of the Historical Society and received the diaries from Mim, and that probably, as you said, having looked at some of Mim's unfiltered writings, decided that they should be sealed. And then 30 years later, they could be opened up. So India could have destroyed those. One of the saddest experiences of my early teaching about diaries was that one of my students in Iowa City said, my grandfather-in-law, were staying in his mansion, has remarkable diaries. He would like you to see them. So we were invited for an evening to come to see these remarkable diaries. Mr. Strong had a private secretary. They were indexed. But we were met at the door by his son, who said, my father's diaries contain personal material. They will never see the light of day. And they were absolutely beautiful. And on a recent trip to Iowa City, I looked in the archives and it just says memorial description by his son. All those diaries destroyed. So diaries are very powerful. Mary Koss here, who studies violence against women, recommends that women who are abused keep a diary, because often their abusers will try to make them question history or dates. But if your abuser finds your diary, run for your life. So they're remarkably powerful documents. So I guess I'm happy to be buried in them for all of my career. Can I say one more jab?
Yeah, yes.
Okay. I had lived in Tucson, but decided to go back for graduate studies in Iowa City in American Studies. And the graduate committee unanimously accepted me, but the department had called and said, God knows why in the world you would want to study women's diaries. Mm-hmm. So I thought of him fondly in New Zealand for 6 months, going, this is why in the world you want to study women's diaries. It can take you all over the world. The human desire to tell their side of the story is what breathes life into diaries.
Definitely. And like you said, it really only takes one person to say, this is valuable. And maybe...
Or this is too dangerous.
Right. On the flip side of that, right? And maybe if we kind of hold on to it, we wait you know, the requisite 30 years or whatever it is that we need to wait, then we can let people know this. Or like the other story that you told, it's too dangerous and it can never see the light of day, right? Like there's something really, we tend to write diaries off as something that silly girls do. But we underestimate their power.
There's a wonderful article called something like Embedding Oneself in the Heart of the Family. And it was advice to Victorian girls about writing a diary. Okay. And it basically said that you should keep them as a good daughter. Well, it turned out that these girls would go to their bedroom and say, I hate my brother. I wish he would choke, etc. So they could both be lovely at the dinner table and then write their heart out in their diaries. So it was a safety valve for them.
I just thought of another question. Do you think that there's, you said you thought Mim expected people to eventually read her diary. Do you have a sense or a guess as to what she may have left out?
That's an excellent question. Probably many of her own foibles. Because I'm the diarist. I get to tell my story. So often you'll notice the day after a party in which she criticizes people for their drinking, she's unwell. Okay. So it may have been the same thing for her. She does not tell us, gosh, I should be able to find it, why they did not have children. One theory is that if a person were tubercular, they weren't even supposed to kiss another person. So that may be part of the courtship correspondence that they left out. Maybe Mim said to Patty, ours would have to be a companionate marriage of just two people close to each other. So I think that's really a difficult question. And one of my difficulties has been Mim's very unflattering, hateful, exhausted opinion of young children. And many of my oral history interviewees said, oh, she just loved our children. Oh, we would come over and she was just so doting. And when I would then read Mim's comments, I thought, oh, what a hypocrite she is. Okay, then I thought back to the times we tortured my great-grandmother. Anyway, but then I decided she was the consummate hostess, which is what her obituaries called her, a hostess, that she could make you feel loved and welcome. And then have that safety valve of the diary to say, the child was a millstone around my neck. After the visit of these children, Tucker will be a relief. I mean, the children really exasperated her. But then again, she was feeding them cookies and 7-Up, so she probably got them.
Round them up a little bit, yeah.
One other thing we didn't discuss was whether or not Patty may have had an emotional or physical love interest in their fairly early days. And again, we don't know what Mim might have destroyed. The other party's diary, when Mim finally confronts this woman, her diary, all those pages are torn out, very obviously. Like, I'm not going to tell you in history.
But something happened, and I want you to know that something happened.
Yes, exactly. I mean, you'll see cross-outs and people cutting holes in diaries to about Mim envisioning these diaries being published. I mean, she would put footnotes saying, look for this on this page. She had little signifiers saying, here's a footnote to what I said. She would identify people with brackets that she would know, but you, the new reader, in the late 20th century wouldn't know. So she clearly had others in mind. You have a tent. They were going to live in a tent, all right? And it was a tough market. So even when they found places, it would be too expensive. Okay, so you find that.
Don't they live in a house with two young college boys at one point?
That's down here in Tucson
Yeah.
when they have to take in boarders, okay, which was a kind of genteel, quiet way of earning a little extra money.
Yeah, definitely.
Right. So yes, the fact that she's so close to her neighbors, they can hear them singing at night, and probably vice versa. And neighbors telling them, "Could you pipe it down? It's 4 a.m. Should I put on my pajamas and join you?" Insight. And then, as you mentioned, the changing demographics of Tucson. We had to drive so far to Wilmot to see these people's homes. Okay, as the community begins to spread out. Definitely.
I was fascinated when they lived with or they rented from a Mrs. Fernandez, and she got a phone call, I guess, that Patty overheard, and they like moved out the next day.
Right. Which convinced us we should move.
Yeah.
Right. And we haven't addressed her attitudes toward Mexican Americans or African Americans, and she runs the gamut. What I've been discussing with colleagues is how she seems to classify Hispanic people into workers, Mexicans, and then someone like Gilbert Ronstadt is very musical and cultivated and interesting. And then she is, for her time, remarkably tolerant and accepting of African Americans, remarkably. And as her friends mention bigoted comments, she really takes umbrage. But the fact that much earlier in U.S. history, the Irish and African Americans were sometimes lumped together as this subhuman working class, maybe that awakened her.
She seemed sensitive to slights against the Irish, certainly. So I would imagine that translated to.
But often not slights against Mexican Americans. More often she would say the slight. And that does bring up one thing I love about diaries is I think all of us feel a little bit of being an outsider. And often diarists that I've studied feel themselves outsiders. People don't understand how cultured I am. People don't understand how hard I work. They don't understand how well read I am. And you see that. And so Fothergill calls these people compensatory diarists. I'm going to tell the world how feeling I am, how cultured I am. Mim has all those reading lists. Did I mention how cultured I am? Belongs to a book club, and reviews books. So she wants us to know that she mattered,